when you say you make money, what you normally do when you make money is transfer money from someone else to yourself. Now, I mean literally manufacture money. Previously there was no money, you manufacture it, then there is some money. So, what's a fiat currency system? These are cute cars. That has nothing to do with it. A fiat currency is a state-issued currency whose only value derives from the legal tender laws and the taxation laws. As to say, it has no objective value other than it's just fiat currency. If I had a $50 note handy, I'd wave it around and say it only has value because of the Australian laws, and if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't even bother picking it up from the ground. A commodity currency is where you use something that has some intrinsic value of some kind and use that as money. Now, one of the main themes of this talk is how the West converted from a commodity currency to a fiat currency in stages from 1914 to 1971. And I won't be going into the pathological details of how it did that, just that it emerged in 1971 as a pure fiat currency. So where does our money come from? Some people don't realise there's a lot more money around now than there used to be. $1 million used to be a lot of money. Nowadays it buys you a house. So someone must be manufacturing it. It's a bit of a taboo topic. No one ever talks about manufacturing money. And that's an important point in and of itself. What it does is it retards the economic conversation to do with anything to do with money to a kindergarten level, because hardly anyone can discuss it accurately because basically they get tripped up by the details. I'll bet most of you don't really know how money is manufactured. And remember, when I say money, I don't just mean physical cash. Most money is in bank accounts and just goes from one bank account to another. We hear it referred to in the press quite commonly. For instance, you often hear that the economy is overheating or has cooled down a bit. Now, overheating, I'll bet you, is not something you can measure with a thermometer. Money manufacture kind of dominates the economic landscapes once you're aware of it. Interest rates. Interest rates is the price of manufacturing money. As interest rates go up, the amount of manufacture goes down and vice versa. A bubble is when there's too much money. Too much has been manufactured. The GFC was caused by the private sector just pooping out and not able to create any more money because it had got debt saturation. Money is power. The manufacture of money over the last few hundred years has largely determined who the financial elites, or who the elites in our society are. Perhaps that's got something to do with why we don't talk about it. Alright, what if you could manufacture money? What if you had a little machine in the corner that spat out money? You wouldn't have to work. You could just produce the medium of exchange and bypass all that messy business of producing goods and services that other people want. You could get someone to do nearly anything you wanted. There's a story about Winston Churchill and a lovely young socialite. Winston Churchill is alleged to have said to the socialite, "Madam, would you sleep with me for £5 million?" And the young socialite was a bit flustered and thought, we would have to discuss terms and conditions. Winston says, "Would you sleep with me for £5?" And Madam says, "Certainly not. What sort of woman do you think I am?" And Winston replies, "We've already established that. We're just haggling about the price." Alright, the good news is that no one can just legally manufacture money without consequence. The system is not that unfair. There's no one who has a money machine that just spits out money and they can go around spinning it. Counterfeiting is illegal. And in legal manufacture, whenever you create money, there's a matching liability that goes with it. That prevents the sort of gross exploitation of the manufacturing power I was just alluding to. Bad news. Some people, historically, over the last few hundred years, have found ways of capturing a significant chunk of the value from money manufacture by what you might call second-order effects. They're wealthy, they tend not to work very hard. They don't provide goods and services that the rest of us want. Historically, when we've had fiat currencies created out of nothing, eventually you get an outbreak of corruption and, general unfairness. And as a result, fiat currencies tend to die after 1 or 2 generations, usually about 25 to 50 years. Remember, our fiat currencies technically started in 1971, which was 39 years ago. All All right, so there's all this silence about money manufacture. Money manufacture is central to our economy, yet hardly anyone discusses it. So what conclusion can we draw from that? I think the first and most obvious conclusion is that someone must be making money out of it. Someone must be deriving an advantage from this situation. Otherwise, they'd probably complain about how onerous it is to create money, to manufacture money. The second point is that whoever makes this money is able to keep other people fairly quiet about it, because the press and the economists and all the economic commentators rarely talk about it, and if they do, they tend to use euphemisms. Now, banking, as we know it, is about 6 or 7 centuries old. It's not a secret. It's out there in the open. But most people never get to understand it because it's too damn complex and confusing, and it's full of misdirection. It takes a fair bit of effort to understand banking well enough. I'm not going to try to explain the whole of banking in 40 minutes. You'll be glad to know. But I am going to take you through the main salient features so that you can understand where money comes from and understand the effect on your life. And if you ever get into an argument with one of these people, you'll know the main points and you can be fairly certain and stick up for yourself, because they will bamboozle you. Most of the time we just can't be bothered figuring out how the money system works because it seems to work well enough. And the people who organise the second order effects, they're just distributing real value away from your money at a slow rate that you don't really notice very much. Here's a real expert on making things, Henry Ford. Renowned to have said in about 1920 that it is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there'd be a revolution before tomorrow morning. There was nearly a revolution at Canberra Airport this morning. After being dicked around all day and sleeping on the floor and what have you, and being told umpteen times that they were terribly apologetic, but it'd be another 15 minutes, a couple of people got into a shouting match with the receptionist at the front. And about 2 minutes later, 4 big cops, bigger than me, showed up. So they were just patrolling back and forth through the whole departure lounge where we were. Anyway, there was no revolution. We're very meek. History, oh yeah, barter's inefficient. You've got to meet exactly the right person who has what you want. There's no change. It's all chunky. It's totally hopeless. Big step forward was commodity money. Commodity money. Excuse me. Gold evolved as the commodity of choice for money in pretty much all of the big mainland of the world, Asia, Europe, Africa, and also big areas of Central and South America. And the world pretty much used coins directly until about the Middle Ages, when we got the next big advance, which was we used representations of gold rather than the gold itself, which was terribly more convenient but did allow a certain amount of chicanery. Speaking of chicanery, we've got to tackle this topic, so we might as well do it now. Fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking is the second greatest instrument in the financial world after money itself. And if you don't understand it, you're probably a victim. In one slide, I'm going to explain the essence of the system, and if you know this, a lot of stuff about money will make sense. The way it developed historically was that goldsmiths, who were backyard tinkerers in the sort of scummy end of town, pretty low status people, often took gold deposits and issued receipts for them. So if I gave the goldsmith to look after my gold, he'd give me a receipt, maybe for a few ounces of gold. But you know what? Rather than pay for something with a gold coin, I could give Marcus the receipt for the gold, and then he would be able to go to the goldsmith anytime he likes and recover the gold. So what tended to happen was that the goldsmith's receipts circulated as money because they're a lot more convenient. And here's the magic. The goldsmiths somehow learned that they could issue more receipts and they had gold. Now, if they just gave themselves some receipts and went out and spent them, eventually the receipts would come back on them and they'd have to come up with some gold because the goldsmith had to honour any receipts that turned up. So that sort of gross exploitation was no good. What they learned to do instead was to lend out some extra receipts and charge interest on them.
That's fine, yeah.
Got to charge some interest?
Yeah, it'll be
because
yeah. Okay.
Those receipts, you might get there might be a non-repayment. You might not get repaid for that money you've lent out. What they found was that typically you can lend out about 10 times as many receipts as you have gold deposits. That's basically banking. Let's go through an example. Supposing a goldsmith has deposits of 200 ounces. So that's 200 little coins, each about the size of a 50-cent piece. You'd probably stick them in that jar there. Not very much. He issues receipts to the people who own them for those 200 ounces. But then the goldsmith issues the receipts for a further 1,800 ounces. So you've got your 10-to-1 ratio. He charges 5% interest on those extra receipts. So that's an income of 90 ounces per year. 90 ounces doesn't sound much till you realise that an ounce of gold costs about 1,400 Aussie today. So that's about $120,000 or $130,000 per year. For looking after 200 bits of gold that would fit in a jar that big. Banking's a pretty cool game. The goldsmith pays gold to anyone who presents the receipt, then destroys the receipt. It's all up front. Banking is a very profitable game so long as everyone repays their loans. And if you think about this, you might notice that the borrowers need to find more gold to pay the interest because they've got to pay the original gold back and interest. This creates a certain need to constantly expand the amount of gold and money out there. All right, let's go through a few features of the fractional reserve system. Two very important terms in discussing money. If people try to discuss money without these terms, they generally don't know what they're talking about. First one is base money. Base money is the underlying thing that constitutes money. And then the second one is bank money. Bank money is what the bank does to amplify up the underlying base. Bank money is what banks create, and generally they're always in the form of receipts. Bank money is created out of nothing. Yet I can use that bank money to buy things just the same as you can with the gold. It amplifies the base money by about 10. And typically about 90% of money is created by banks just by lending. Note in particular, just as with the goldsmith, the depositor's money is not lent out. Depositors have access, and that's true in today's monetary system as well. Depositors have access to their money at all times. It is not lent out. There's a few problems here. The sort of generic sort of problem is that once you create something out of nothing, you encourage a bit of chicanery and cheating. For centuries, it's not like this was invented in the Middle Ages, it just became more common then. Fractional reserve banking was outlawed as immoral by governments for ages. Another problem is that private banks, each issuing their own receipts as money, aren't necessarily interchangeable. For instance, if we were doing it in Australia today, Westpac might issue Westpac dollars and NAB might issue NAB dollars, and maybe NAB wouldn't accept Westpac dollars or would only pay out on them 90 cents in the dollar or some rubbish like that. Very inconvenient. Big problem, of course, is that banks can fail in a bank run, just like the goldsmith. Supposing people catch wind of the fact that the goldsmith only has 200 ounces of gold and there are receipts for 2,000. And they might get upset about it and they all rush there to get their gold, and the first 200 will be satisfied, the next 1,800 will just miss out. Another concept here is money supply. Money supply is a bit of a technical term, it confuses some people. It just means the money in circulation. There's a supply of money, just like there's in the housing market, there's a supply of housing. So we talk about the housing supply. Now, the way private banks really make money is or certainly used to, it's somewhat moderated today by the presence of a central bank. Only somewhat though. Private banks profit big time by manipulating the money supply. They cause fluctuations in the amount of money in society. When they lend freely by lowering interest rates, so lots of people want to create money, manufacture money, borrow money with these low interest rates, we get an increasing amount of debt, the money supply booms, the economy booms. Then the cunning old bankers in their cartel say, we're going to raise interest rates. Or indeed, sometimes they cut off lending. The United States didn't have a central bank for most of the 1800s. There was a famous occasion in 1891. The bank sent out letters to all the banks right throughout the country saying, on 1st of September 1894, we're going to cut off lending. We want to engineer a recession. We're going to lower the money supply starting on that date. They knew about it 3 years ahead of time. So for 3 years ahead of that time, they were lending like crazy. Come the 1st of September 1894, they simply cut off lending. When you cut off lending, the money supply soon busts, debts can't be repaid, businesses go bust. And here's the important ingredient. The business failures allow banks to buy good businesses very cheaply because they're failing or they owe money to the banks and they can't repay it. You sort of joke about banks that bank fees are just to annoy the customers. And interest is nice. You make steady income that way. But the way you really get rich, and the way that the banking families traditionally really got rich, was to make the money supply fluctuate and then buy businesses cheap on the downside. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had a monster bubble in the last 30 years. So there might be some real bargains coming up in the next 10. There are economic problems with the fractional reserve system. First of all, the money supply is fluctuating because it depends on the amount of lending, which depends on interest rates and how many animal spirits people have. So you get fluctuating prices, fluctuating interest rates, you get a business cycle, and you get an unstable economy. There was no business cycle before fractional reserve was allowed. Creating something out of nothing in a more general sense causes economic distortions and misallocation of resources. The economic signals sent by prices are distorted by banks lowering and raising interest rates and what have you. And basically, you spend too much time, too many people in the population spend too much time gaming the system, squabbling over the medium of exchange rather than producing goods and services that everyone wants. You can see that today. A large part of the profits in our society are earned by the financial industry. And a lot of the smarter people from universities are all wanting to clamour to get into the courses at universities that feed into banking and the financial industry. Whereas engineering and manufacturing and so on suffers. We don't make things as a society anymore. Leave that to the Japanese and the Chinese. That's going to come back and bite us on the bum pretty badly. By the way, I was an engineer. I did engineering at Stanford, which is one of the better US universities. And while I was there, that change was on. It was in the 80s. There was just a change. Engineering just became unfashionable. Too much hard work. The American students didn't want to do it. They all went flocking off to business school and were looking for jobs as merchant bankers and stuff. And lo and behold, we've got a big bubble. And Japan's taken over their manufacturing crown. All right, the bankers have a solution to a few of those problems, and it's namely a central bank. With a central bank, you can guarantee private banks against bank runs, because if a bank run starts developing in a private bank, then the central bank can come and put in more gold or base money, whatever it is. It also gets rid of the problem about NAP and Westpac having their own separate currencies, because you homogenise it all into a national currency, which also means that the banks basically are manufacturing national currency. They're basically a utility of the government. They tame the business cycle somewhat, and because they take a lot of the risk away for the bankers, they give the bankers even more profits. Two notable central banks are the Bank of England, which was finally started in 1694. That's when the British Crown, under pressure of needing money for wars, finally relented and allowed fractional reserve banking and set up its own central bank. They were only the second country in the world to do so. 30 years earlier, the Swedes had done it, also under the pressure of war. And one by one, the European powers succumbed to the fashion of central banking and fractional reserve banking, always to fight wars. Because by manufacturing a whole lot of this money not based on anything, you basically could encourage mercenaries and your own troops to fight, and you could buy equipment and so on. You had to be able to make credible promises like that. So the pressure of war is what really keeps fractional reserve going. The US Federal Reserve, current one, started in 1913. Not a lot of people know this, but it's actually the third central bank in the United States. First two crashed and burned. Got rid of. Banking used to be a major issue in US history. For instance, Andrew Jackson was president around 1830 for 8 years. And getting rid of the second central bank in the United States was one of his main issues. His campaign slogan was, Jackson and no bank. All right, so it's a pretty primary issue. And it took him 8 years to get rid of it, but he did get rid of it. And so there was no central bank in the US from about 1830 through to 1913. Now I'm talking about the switching from gold. Using gold as base money constrains the money supply, but governments often need more money. So over 1913 to 1971, We moved in stages from using gold as the base money to using a pure fiat currency created by the government. And the events that kicked off the major parts of that move were, first of all, World War I. World War I created an insatiable desire for money from the combatants. They issued war bonds by the truckload. War bonds were repayable in, say, British pounds, but a British pound was defined as a certain amount of gold. So after the war, when they tried to get back onto the gold standard, which is what the particularly gold standard that existed before World War I, as soon as a country went onto the gold standard, basically what would happen is people would arrive out of the woodwork with the war bonds and say, please pay us in gold, and the country would run out of gold and they'd have to go back off the gold standard. So it basically wrecked the gold standard by issuing too many war bonds. So governments issued too many of these paper promises and it wrecks the system. Bretton Woods was set up at the end of World War II, and it gave the US a central role, and it was the only place that would redeem paper money for gold. But in the 1960s they broke that because they needed to fund the welfare state, which was starting in the 1960s, and the Vietnam War, and to do it without a tax increase. And by 1971 it was all too much, and Richard Nixon formally ended the last avenue of convertibility of paper money to gold. Since then, we've been on a fiat system. So now, base money is created by the central bank, and there are no technical constraints on how much it can create. Base money only derives its value from its legal status. So let's quickly go to discuss manufacturing today. Our current system has got two something-for-nothings in it. It's got a fiat base, and then amplifying the fiat currency is a fractional reserve system. We've got base money, which is created by the central bank, and then bank money, created by the private banks. Each form is unbacked. Each form is historically somewhat unstable in and of its own right. What could possibly go wrong? All right, base money is easy to cope with. There are two forms of base money. One is physical cash. That's just made on a printing press or a coin press. And money in account at the central bank. And the way that the central bank creates new money, like Mr. Bernanke did last week. Actually, that's not right, so I was correct that he didn't do it this way last week. The way they create money at a central bank is they just put money in a bank account. So a bank account just nowadays consists of a file on a hard drive. It's got an account number and an amount of money, and they just change the number of dollars in there. Just change the amount of money, just on a keyboard, like that. That's how it's done. That manufacture is technically unconstrained, but it's moderated in practice by the need of the central bank not to raise inflationary expectations. Now, modern bank money is a bit trickier. It's only got one form. That's money in an account at a private bank. So it's easy to figure out what's bank money in our society. It's just the stuff in your bank account. Again, it's manufactured by increasing an account balance on a computer. If you take out a loan, you sign a document giving the bank legal title to your house, and in return, the bank goes to its computer and types in a number. Of course, it's a number in a bank account, and that bank account is honoured by the other banks, so they can transfer that money from bank account to bank account, and that's how commerce works today. Yep. Creating bank money by private banks is subject to a lot of constraints. The private bank must have sufficient reserves of base money at the central bank at all times to cover all its issued bank money. Again, there's an amplification factor of about 10 to 1. That still exists. It's not really much of a constraint because private banks can borrow base money from other private banks or even from the central bank at virtually no cost. So it's really not a constraint, but it's technically still there. And about 90 to 95% of all money today in our societies is bank money. All right? That base money is just a little sliver, about 5%, maybe 10%. New bank money is created by lending. In today's society, debt is money. Interest is being paid on all that bank money. Whenever a private bank creates bank money, it also creates a matching liability on its books. And if the private bank's liabilities ever exceeds its assets, and its assets are just performing loans, it must cease business. Right? So there's a penalty to just creating money out of nothing and overdoing it. And when bank money is repaid, when you repay your mortgage, that money is destroyed, cancelled, disappears back into nothing. You just work it off the matching liability. All right, what's the constraints on banks, private banks creating bank money? This is a major factor in the way our economy works. The reserves can simply be borrowed, so forget about them. The major constraints in practice are what's called the Basel Accords, or the Basel capital ratios. The Basel Accords started in 1988. That's how modern banking works. All right? So people who tell you that you put your money in the bank and the bank lends it out to other people, it's not how it works. All right? Lending more deposits into banks doesn't really create much more money in society. I'll explain why. The main constraint is Tier 1 ratio. Tier 1 capital is basically how many losses can be absorbed by the bank without having to cease trading. It's how many mistakes it can make. And it's equal to the equity capital, which is the amount of money the bank received on issuing new shares, plus any profits it made. Assets are things that the bank owns, which is your house, the loans, the bonds, cash, all that good stuff. And there's a ratio. Normally you've got to keep it around 4%, although investors now demand 10% because it's a bit risky these days. So the crucial point here is that a bank can create more bank money if it either makes less risky loans, or thereby reducing the risk-weighted assets, or it raises more equity capital. So in the GFC, you saw the major Australian banks go around issuing more bank capital. They issued a lot more shares. As soon as the coast looked all right for banks, like they were going to survive, particularly CommBank and Westpac issued a lot more bank shares. Also, increasing the depositors' funds decreases the risk-weighted assets, which also means they can create more bank money. But it's a relatively minor effect. Last year, banks made 45% on new bank equity capital. That is, they issued more shares, received money for them, and they made a return of 45% on that money. This is roughly how they do it. This is roughly how they do it. Okay, you raise $1 by issuing new bank shares. You lend that out about 10 times over, so you create you manufacture $10 of bank money. You charge interest of about 6% on that bank money. You're probably running 1 or 2% of costs. So your income is 10 times 6% minus 1.5%, or about 45%. So it's a pretty lucrative game. I bet you can't get 45% on your money at a bank. Note that private banks do not lend out depositors' funds. They're still available on demand. Note also that there are far more borrowers than there are lenders. Nearly everyone in society is a borrower, including big corporations. There are relatively few lenders. In a democracy, that has important implications. I'll get to that. A private bank, particularly in Australia, also has another mechanism for increasing its borrowing. That is, it can simply borrow money overseas at low interest rates, particularly from Japan and the United States, ship it to Australia and lend out the same money with no manufacturing involved, which is why Australian banks do a fair bit of that, which is why we're vulnerable to overseas interest rate changes and currency rate changes. Okay, modern money. Bank money represents base money. They're always exchanged at 1-to-1. If they ever stopped being exchanged at 1-to-1, there'd be a riot. Base money and bank money are actually kept separate within the banking system. All the bean counters behind there, they actually keep them separate at all times. Nearly every transaction in society just transfers bank money from one bank account to another bank account. When I buy a clean shirt at the local department store using my credit card, money is transferred from the bank account of MasterCard to the bank account of the department store. And then later on, I transfer some money from my bank account to the bank account of MasterCard. When you buy a car with a cheque, all it's doing is transferring money from your bank account to the seller's bank account. The system gives some people systematic advantage, which gives them an incentive to an unsustainable build-up of debt and bank money. One other topic I want to cover quickly. What is monetization? It's a word you hear increasingly nowadays, because a lot of it's going on. That's when the central bank buys stuff with newly created base money. Most central banks are only allowed to create base money in order to buy something, and it usually has to be AAA rated, but that can be waived for GFC or something like that comes along. You can monetize anything, but it's usually bonds. And here's how modern money printing works. First of all, the Treasury, i.e. the government, issues bonds. The central bank then buys them with newly created base money. The government spends that money, and then the Treasury or the government pays interest to the central bank as per the bond repayment schedule. It's a bit complicated, but essentially that's how printing money works today. The quantitative easing 2, which I'm sure you all know about last week, did not work that way. Instead, Bernanke is creating new money at the central bank, but is using it in the to buy currently existing bonds on the open market, which has the extra effect of suppressing or lowering interest rates on the open market. All right, here's the story of your financial life. The monetary experiment started in 1982. Why 1982? I've been talking about 1971. 1971, we switched to fiat currencies. But there'd been a bubble in the 1960s, a smallish bubble, but a bubble nonetheless. And the 1970s was mainly about working through the inflation created by that 1960s bubble and the oil shocks and all that stuff, right? But Paul Volcker, who preceded Greenspan, reset interest rates to about 20% in 1980 in order to wring inflation out of the system and bring a halt to all of that stuff. We're going to start afresh. So the system went from a reset in 1980. We've got a new extreme monetary experiment, never been tried before. A base money, purely fiat, and a bank money created by the private banks. What could possibly go wrong? It's the biggest bubble ever. Hasn't quite ended. It's sort of ending. Now, bubbles are due to excess money. Prices are the ratio of the amount of money, the money supply, to the amount of goods and services to buy. So when there's more money, prices go up. And it isn't smooth right across the economy. It operates sector by sector, particularly as banks become willing to lend into a sector. For instance, housing prices won't go up until banks are willing to lend into the housing sector. Or gold won't go up until various authorities take their foot off it, and so on. But don't expect prices to move uniformly across society, because they don't. Now, what happens when central banks keep interest rates low, thereby encouraging lots of money manufacture, and they simply keep the rates low until something breaks? We've done it twice now. First time was in 1929. Okay, the US Federal Reserve was only created in 1913. There was an interruption for World War I. Then after World War I, they just said, right, let's keep interest rates low as we can. Everyone's happy. Lots of money's been created and sprayed around society. Well, the system broke in 1929. The central bank then made the mistake of saying, oh, we'd better honour all those debts, and it sort of did the right thing and didn't inject in liquidity. It allowed the money supply to collapse, and you got a big depression. In the GFC, where this started happening as well, you got a break. The central banks did the opposite, and they all created lots of liquidity and sprayed even more money around, which is the opposite reaction. All right, Bernanke is a student of the Great Depression, and he swore that he wasn't going to make the same mistake the central banks made in 1929. So we've run the experiment twice now. 1929, and that shouldn't be 2012 on that slide. That should be 2008 when it busted. We've now, in one case, we let the central banks allow the money supply to collapse. In the other case, we let the central banks push the money supply up even higher. It's quite easy to track bubbles at a society-wide level. Modern money is all debt, so the amount of money is just equal to total debt. And we know what the total debt is. You just go and ask all the banks, because banks is money. Debt is money, and the banks create it all, so you just ask them how much debt they've got. The size of the economy is roughly measured by the GDP, so the debt to GDP ratio gives you an idea of how big the bubble is in a society. Our bubble started with President Reagan. President Reagan had a fairly dismissive attitude about fiat currencies. He said, deficits don't matter. Here, I'll prove it. And he did. Okay, this complicated graph comes from Carl Denninger's site. He put the green stuff as the GDP, the orange stuff as the debt. Ignore those. Just look at the grey stuff. See that grey line? Now, we started in 1950. It goes through to May 2010, this graph. Now, we marked some salient points on there. I haven't got a pointer, so I'll just work through them from left to right. We changed to fiat currency with Nixon in 1971, and the bubble really started in 1982. Then rose quite quickly. We got a crash in 1987, which coincidentally happened at a ratio of 235%, which is exactly where the crash in 1929 happened. Stock market crashes occur at 235%. We've run the experiment twice. Then things levelled out for a while. We had a bit of a recession in 1991 or so. Then what I call the Clinton strategy started in 1994 or 5, somewhere around there. A previous speech alluded to that, and I'll tie it in with that in a moment. We got Greenspan's irrational, exuberant speech by the end of 1996. Then we had to have the tech bubble, we had a housing bubble, and finally we had the GFC in 2008. Up at when the level had risen to about 360%. Here's the same graph again, only I think it's clearer, and it gives a longer span of time. See, it goes all the way from 1870 through to 2010. The normal setting for the system is about 150%. But there are two really big spikes on there. One was the 1929 and depression spike. And the other one is the one we got today, the bubble that we got today. Now, in 1929, although the crash occurred at 235%, the GDP then dropped rather alarmingly, which pushed the ratio up even higher. So the ratio actually peaks in 1933, but the damage was done before that. Notice too in this graph you can see the changes more easily. The Clinton strategy kicking in 1994 or 5 made a lot of difference. It restarted the bubble. There were a few years there where the bubble didn't grow, and Clinton restarted it. So Clinton and Reagan, they're our guys. Here's what the Clinton strategy consisted of. Well, first of all, Clinton's problem. Clinton found that when he came to government in 1993, whenever he suggested anything that involved spending, the bond market would take fright and promptly put up interest rates, which put up people's mortgage rates, which made Clinton unpopular. So if Hillary breathed anything about a healthcare scheme, suddenly the bond vigilantes had set the bond market onto him, and that was bad. So Slippery Bill needed a way of allowing interest rates to be held down while spending more government money. See, it's always about government wants to spend more. World War I, the war bonds, the Vietnam War, welfare state, always the government wants to spend more money. Now, Clinton had a good solution to this. It worked. Larry Summers was involved in this. The Gibson paradox. First of all, he managed to lower the long-term interest rates. Now, short-term interest rates are what the central bank sets, overnight interest rates. But out there at 2 years, 5 years, 10 years and so on, it's the open market, the bond market that sets interest rates. And the US bond market is the biggest, deepest, most mature market in the world. So manipulating that market is difficult. However, they had some new devices called derivatives, and they went after the bond vigilantes, and using derivatives and a great deal of government promises, they managed to basically put the bond vigilantes out of business by, I don't explain how they do it exactly, but they just jerk the market around in non-intuitive ways, and eventually the bond vigilantes give up and go home sort of broke. As evidence that the government is doing that, JP Morgan, one of our favourite banks in the silver market, JP Morgan are widely renowned to be the US's main go-to man when it comes to manipulating markets. JP Morgan has $80 trillion worth of interest rate derivatives. That's trillion with a T. World GDP is about 60 trillion, so 80 trillion is a truly immense amount of money for one bank to have, so it is widely thought that the US government is giving us some sort of guarantee. There's no secret about that figure. You can find it in US Federal Reserve accounts. They track derivatives and how much the big banks have. But there are two other aspects to Clinton's strategy. He wanted to lower interest rates artificially, but he didn't want the market to catch on otherwise, so he had to suppress the CPI. A guy called Boskin created the Boskin Commission. They sent all sorts of ingenious statistical methods for not allowing the CPI to go up. They just simply left out a lot of stuff out of the CPI, and they used all sorts of tricks, including hedonic calculations and stuff. It's a mess. It's a long topic in its own right, and I'm not going to go there. And the third thing he did is, the other big inflation canary in the gold mine is, of course, gold. So they've been suppressing the gold price since about 94, 95. Same trick as they used with the long-term interest rates. They used derivatives to suppress the gold price by jerking the price around in all sorts of fancy ways, but ultimately keeping it down a lot and getting central banks to sell most of their gold. The result was that we had lower short-term and long-term interest rates, and we extended the bubble to be the biggest, deepest, longest, most worldwide bubble ever. Just to remind you, notice where the Clinton strategy starts there in 1995. Notice how it just takes off. We've been doing it ever since. Now, I've been talking exclusively about the US, and these figures are from the US, but the Australian figures, from what I can find out, occasionally get glimpses of them, are roughly the same. All the Western countries are running roughly the same debt to GDP ratio, and they all copy the American monetary policy because they have to. Because if you don't copy the Americans, your currency goes up too fast and you can't export anything and you're broke in no time. All right, that's for any exporters here, you might notice the Australian dollar is a bit high at the moment because we're not copying the Americans well enough. We put up our interest rates. Okay, the bubble is now ending. Why? You can't do this forever. The world is running out of borrowing capacity. Here's why. There's simply not enough income to service all that debt. Let's walk you through the figures in very round terms. The debt's about 400% of GDP, a little bit less. Interest rates, say 4%. Well, that means you've got 4 times 400%, 16% of the GDP being paid each year in interest payments. Might as well flush it down the toilet. It's not being... The economy just can't bear a burden. At some point it breaks. Also, the world's running out of unencumbered capital. Virtually every decent business, house, bit of land, whatever, is being used as collateral by banks. You've got a loan out on it. So money manufactured by the private banks stalled. And as it happened, it had stalled in 2008. That's what we had with the GFC. Okay, the response of the politicians is great. They did stimulus programs. They're basically trying to replace that private debt growth, which we've had for the last 28 years, with public debt growth. They're using base money manufacture. Basically, the politicians and the public think that the bubble was normal and that we could just keep this up forever. In 1982, when this started, I was 20 years old. Now I've got grey hair. I'll bet most of you didn't really have any significant economic life before 1982, or not for very long. We've all grown up in a bubble environment. We just expect it as normal for the amount of money to increase and all the effects that has, the sort of continual growth we have. It's not normal, it's a bubble. But we've grown so used to it, it seems like normal. So now the politicians are busy trying to restore normal for us. They want to kickstart back to normal with yet more debt. The political system doesn't appear at this stage to know what's going on. They've got no idea of that graph I showed you. Well, okay, I showed you the same graph 3 times, so just one graph. They don't know how money is manufactured. They were totally surprised by the GFC, and they still, you read economic journal and stuff, mainstream Keynesian economics and the mainstream politicians still don't really know what caused it. They're still scratching around for ideas. It's sort of like a cargo cult. Like one of these amazing planes the Pacific Islanders built, you know, it's like create more debt and stimulus and the good stuff will just resume somehow. The banking class, meanwhile, are having a good old time. They profited mightily during the bubble. Give you an example, one telling statistic. Before the bubble started, the finance industry had about 5% of the nation's, or most Western nations' employees, and about 5% of their total profits. By 2006, the financial industry still had around about 5% of total employees, but it was earning 45% of all profits. Okay, all those people who were going to be engineers become financial engineers instead, and that's where the action was. They quite correctly got in on the action. But it's not real action, because the finance industry doesn't create goods and services that people ultimately want. It's just a medium of exchange. Banking class are also laughing because they got bailed out and protected at the end of the bubble. How do you like that? The banking class also know what's coming next. They already own the next assets. They're going to do well in the next phase of things. Remember I told you the game for banking over the last few hundred years was they make their most money out of creating lots of cheap money, then crashing the system and buying businesses cheap. Well, that's what's going to happen. The essence of the problem is that money is a promise. It's a promise implied that money today will be able to have similar purchasing power in the future. We've motivated in the last couple of decades a great deal of work and effort by those promises. But we've got too much debt, we've got too many promises, and not all those promises can be kept. That is, not all those debts can be repaid in dollars that are near the current value. Someone's going to have to lose their dollars or their purchasing power. Business as usual is not an option anymore. We know that because we have the GFC and money creation has stalled because the amount of interest payment as a percentage of GDP is just too high to bear. We can't do it anymore. It's as if you're an average Aussie family and you'd run up 200k on your credit cards. There is no nice solution. Here's the dismal arithmetic. Between 1994 and 2007, since the Clinton strategy really kicked in, that's the extra good bit, I reckon, or I've seen quite a few accounts that calculate roughly the extra money or debt that added about 1 to 2% to the GDP every year. So we got used to that as a society. Yeah, we had good healthy growth. growth rates. But they were created by that extra money. That was debt borrowed from the future. And if you do it for 17 years at 1 or 2%, you've got probably 15 to 25% of GDP growth borrowed from the future. Well, it's going to have to get paid back. When that debt to GDP ratio goes back to the usual 150% or so, we're going to have to pay back that 15 to 25% of GDP. That's a double depression. A depression is a 10% drop in GDP. We're in line for a double one. This is bigger than 1929. So how is the political system going to deal with this? It can deal with it quickly. It can deal with it slowly. If you do it slowly, maybe you can sort of gradually pay back the future, pay down the debt at roughly the rate of natural GDP growth, and we'll merely get stagnation for 10 or 20 years. Create too much money, you could get into a hyperinflationary mess. Politicians are going to go for the slow route because they just want to minimise the short-term pain. But any mismanagement could see us either fall off into a quick deflationary thing or an inflationary mess. So there's deflation on one side of the chasm, inflation on the other, and the politicians are trying to drive us along a sort of road to stagnation in the middle. It's a great future. That's our economic future for the next 20 years. There'll be winners and losers. The political system will decide which promises are kept and who'll miss out. Do you want formal defaults? Do we want to devalue debt through de-inflation? The 1970s, they had a bit of an aftermath of bubble. They chose to devalue debts through inflation. Basically, the central banks chose to run about 10 to 15% inflation for about 6 years, which halves everyone's real debts. Then they reset the system with 20% interest rates and started again. Can't do that this time. Debt to GDP ratio is a whole lot higher. Politicians are going to be forced to choose inflation. Here's a basic calculus. Remember I said there's lots of people who borrow money and not many who lend it? Well, there's hardly any lenders, but there's lots of borrowers. Lots of voters. So the politicians are going to choose inflation to reduce people's debt burden. That's what Bernanke was about last week. Stimulus money is never going to be repaid. Here's why. If you pay back stimulus money by raising taxes, you suppress future GDP. A pretty well-known academic study estimated that about $3.40 of output is lost for every borrowed dollar spent on stimulus if you try to pay back the stimulus money by raising taxes later. So that's a brain-dead way to go. Politicians are not going to do that. The only way out is to just gross money manufacture. That is, you're going to stimulate with money that you never intend to pay back, and in fact, you just create out of nothing. So, let's skip that bit. We've already covered that. So, most nations will choose to inflate. They'll do it to lower the real debt burden of their voters, and they'll do it to devalue their currency. All the currencies are currently in a race to the bottom. You've probably heard about that. It's become fairly naked in the last 6 months or so. The currencies are deliberately devaluing, except the Aussie currency. Our guys haven't caught on to it yet. The fiat currencies are all going to race to devalue against each other, which basically means they're all trying to lower themselves in value. They must be going down against stuff. So prices are going to rise. In other words, this is another way, a fancy way of saying they're going to generate inflation. Unfortunately, wages, and thus the price of many goods and services, are tied to the CPI. The CPI quite deliberately underestimates inflation. Commodities, on the other hand, are not tied, particularly internationally traded commodities, are not tied to wages. And they'll be the first prices to rise, and they'll rise quite quickly. By the way, anyone notice what happened last week with commodity prices? The rising has started. The currency war has started. It's all on. Bernanke's doing printing. All this stuff that we've talked about for years and we said would happen, it's all happened in the last 10 days.
Sorry about that.
Losers, well, basically people who do the right thing. People who save, people who produce, shareholders, people on fixed incomes, retirees. They're going to get wiped out by a high inflationary outlook in the next few years. People who live from paycheck to paycheck will kind of do okay, but their wages will be tied to CPI, so they'll lose gradually. The economy as a whole will lose because of the friction effects of inflation and the suboptimal allocation of capital. It's generally a pretty bad situation. Inflation sucks. The winners are the people who are profligate. If you just spend all your money before it becomes worthless, that's the right thing to do. Borrow money. It's quite sane at the moment to borrow as much of that stupid bank money as you can and buy some real assets with it. Owners of real assets, particularly those less tied to wages, such as commodities, be careful not to buy most assets like, say, housing or mainstream shares or, well, a lot of stuff really, because that's all going to go down because the economy's not going to do too well. But to the extent that people realise that the problems are caused by a system of money manufacture, gold and silver will probably do all right. I noticed they did quite well last night. Oh, I'll skip that, that's boring. Okay, gold and silver. Gold is honest. It's an anti-cheating device. It's a reliable store of purchasing powers. I'll let you in on a secret. Bankers and government hate gold. They can print the existing money. They can't print gold. Gold is the foremost non-government currency. It evolved in the marketplace over 5,000 years. That's a hell of a pedigree. Fiat currencies, come and go. There have been lots of them already. Gold might return to the monetary system backed by popular demand. Where's the gold price going? I used to trade gold futures, by the way, so this is a real hobby of mine. GFMS, the Kitco, the major banks, each year for the last 10 years, they've always predicted the price of gold will go down. Now they say it's in a bubble. They're clueless. Jim Sinclair, gold legend, picked the top of the 1980 peak. He reckons $1,650 per ounce. He put a date on it, 23rd of January 2011. I hope he's right. He's a very brave man. Judging by last night's action, maybe he will be correct. He'll be even more of a legend if he gets this one right. I'm putting a $1,600 price, but I reckon it'll take till about April. All right, so I was a bit wimped out on that. I didn't put a date on it exactly. But I'll also make the prediction that gold will be many thousands of US dollars per ounce by its peak, and that peak will occur sometime in the time span 2014 to 2020. But beware, wages and costs might have risen considerably, so gold might be sort of $20,000 an ounce. But a hamburger might be $10 instead of $3. Sorry, I've got young kids. I buy my hamburgers from Macca's. A Macca's hamburger will be $10. All right, what can you do? First of all, you are allowed to partake in bank profits. All you have to do is own bank shares. The system is open to anyone to partake. You can profit from the rise of commodities just by owning gold or silver or gold mining shares, silver shares, all those sort of things. You're free to do it. But make sure you get the timing right. You've got banks on one hand and you've got gold and silver on the other. It's like a seesaw. When one's up, the other's down. Don't get the timing wrong. You used to have elite knowledge and move in banking circles to know when they, the magical they, were going to crash the system and when it was better to move out of banking stuff and move into gold and silver. Right? But nowadays, due to the magic of the internet, we can all join in. So the small guy gets a real break at last. All right, what do I do personally? I moved all my investments from banks to 100% gold. I'm currently 100% gold, fully invested in gold. August through March is the best time to invest in gold each year. The other half of the year, I go a bit lighter on it. I invest entirely in ASX gold, the stocks I own are all on ASX stocks for security. I don't trust the North American system of ownership. I think it's deliberately got flaws in it with their failure to deliver problems and basically counterfeiting of stock. I know people who do invest in North American gold stocks and it'll probably work out quite well for them. But as an Australian citizen, I've got full legal rights in this country and I'll stay here. I get some direct exposure to the gold price via long-dated options. You can get 5-year options on gold on the NYMEX. For instance, a couple of years ago I bought some ones that have a strike price of $1,150, which looked terribly brave when gold was $700, but now that gold's $1,400, they look terribly lucrative. I also traded gold futures, but you've got to have a real stomach for that. I made money out of it, but it just wasn't worth the effort. I also started Gold Nerds. This is a bit of a plug. This is a company we formed to sell spreadsheets that compare all 320 ASX gold stocks. There's a new edition every 2 weeks. If you invest in gold stocks in Australia, I reckon you're mad if you don't have it. And I've run out of time, so that's it.